next big section for programming for athletes comes about with exercise selection. Obviously, there are thousands upon thousands of exercises that we can select from. We have to make sure that whatever exercises you select are going to impact those athletes as much as possible. We don't want to be spinning our wheels doing a lot of exercises that won't impact their sport development all that much. So the first thing you're going to want to do is determine your goal. And there are a lot of different goals that athletes can have. Obviously, their training program should target one or two of these goals the most. You can't target everything and expect to do an extremely good job. So make sure that you have one or two goals in mind that's really your main focus, and you can kind of pick and choose a few other forms of training to help sort of supplement those. So if your goal is to learn an exercise, if you're a fairly basic or fairly new to training, you're going to want to make sure that you're learning the basis of training. The squat, the press, the deadlift, all of these main exercises, you're going to want to break it down into a slow and controlled movement so that that athlete can continuously grow and add weight to those exercises. So what I like to do is do a lot of paused or slow eccentric, slow tempo exercises where the athlete is going maybe 2 or 3 seconds down, 2 or 3 seconds up, all the way down through a full range of motion, perhaps holding that deep end range of motion and then driving up from there. If you can teach the athlete to do the exercises like this, then they have a good basis and understanding of how to perform the exercise, and then they can continuously add weight after that. So I like something like a squat hold or a tempo squat. Exercises like that do a really good job of training for this area for those beginners. And moving on from that, obviously you want to train for health and injury prevention with all the athletes you train, but there's going to be some athletes that are really going to need it a lot more than others. For these guys, typically speaking, they're the ones that already have a lot of that power and strength and speed already in place and ready for them to perform at a high level. Their mitigating factor is making sure that they stay healthy over the course of an entire season. So a lot of times with baseball players, we'll see guys who can throw a ball 95 miles per hour in their season, but if they get hurt year in and year out, they're not going to be able to play at that next level and get that big contract that they desire. So for these athletes who already have all the velocity in place, we're going to want to make sure that we're training with a lot more isometric and eccentric overload exercises. The reason why is because this is going to train for stiffness surrounding the joints to keep them more and more injury free. So these isometric exercises, typically speaking, will be holds for about 20 to 30 seconds at maximal or close to maximal effort at a deep range of motion. What this is going to do is train for tendon stiffness. Tendon stiffness is what we gain from these long duration isometric holds. So exercises like lunge holds or sort of a deep rear foot elevated split squat hold will train for a lot of tendon stiffness in the muscle groups surrounding the knees. Exercises like that are really, really good for overall joint health. Eccentric overload exercises like Nordic hamstring curls or reverse Nordic curls do a good job of training muscular stiffness. The reason why here is titin content, T-I-T-I-N. This titin big molecule binds itself to actin and myosin, and when actin and myosin create those cross bridges that create muscular contraction, as I've talked so much about in the previous videos, titin will sort of envelop itself around actin and myosin. And when actin and myosin come apart and those cross bridges begin to allow the muscles to lengthen, then the titin molecule is sort of going to bind itself to actin and myosin, and that's really where that muscular stiffness comes from. So when we jump and land or have to decelerate a muscle in the kinetic sequence of a movement, those muscle groups are firing eccentrically, and that titin molecule really has to be strong. That comes about from eccentric overload training. Moving on from that, if an athlete needs a lot more maximal force production or hypertrophy, then they're going to want to train with a lot more heavy strength training methods. Typically speaking, you're going to want higher rep schemes with those hypertrophy-based athletes, those athletes who already have good hypertrophy but need a lot more maximal force production. They're going to want lower rep schemes with heavier weight. For the most part here, if you're going to make any sort of progress that will impact the field, you're going to have to progressively overload the athlete over time, adding more and more weight over the course of the program with exercises like the deadlift, squat, bench press, etc. Those types of exercises are ones that are really good at training for that overall force production. Moving on from that, If your goal is more high velocity strength, then you're going to want to program a lot more plyometrics, medicine ball throws, jumping exercises, things like that. Those exercises like med ball slams, chest passes, dumbbell vertical jump, those exercises train for more high velocity strength because the rate coding of the movement is much higher than anything we can do with a weight training exercise in the weight room. Rate coding is motor unit firing rate. So when the central nervous system interacts with those muscle groups involved with an exercise and tells those muscle groups to fire, if the rate coding is higher, those contractile velocities are going to be much faster, therefore the transfer of energy into the implement will be much faster. Whereas if we only train with those heavy strength training methods, we might become more forceful, but in order to transfer all that force to high velocities, you are going to want to make sure that there is a good enough level of rate coding with those muscle groups involved in order to get that job done out on the athletic field, especially in high velocity sports like baseball, cricket, golf. These high velocity sports need that type of training. In my opinion, it's a necessity to have at least some volume of these exercises in the program. More sports-specific realm, obviously this is extremely necessary for sports like baseball. These very technical sports need training with swings and throws and sprints. You have to practice these movements in order to get great at them. Now obviously if you are not a very strong individual and you're very underdeveloped, you're probably going to have to train a lot more heavy strength training than those sport-specific styles of training. If you're already a very big, strong person, but you lack that sport-specific strength and that high-velocity strength and overall coordination with your sport, then you're going to want to do a lot more movements like these at high intensity. Pretty much any sort of drill for your sport would do a good job of training for this, but I like to make sure that whatever drills I'm doing have external cues involved. If all we ever think about is internal cues, thinking about my hand doing this, thinking about my front foot doing this, that ultimately can slow down the movement. And a lot of times you need to have the radar gun there, you need to have some sort of external feedback for how well you're doing an exercise or a drill. And if you don't have that, you might just be spinning your wheels and moving at a slower pace than what's necessary in order to get better at your sporting movement. Moving on from that, if your goal is endurance, a lot of times there are some sports that need more endurance than others. In baseball, you don't need much endurance. The farthest you'll run is only 3 to 4 seconds at a time, and then you get to rest for about 30 seconds or a minute before you have to run, swing, or throw again. So there's not a lot of conditioning that's necessary here, but if you determine that your sport does need a lot more conditioning, something like basketball, football, what you're going to want to work at is shorter rest times with those explosive styles of training like sprints, jumps, and medicine ball throws. And if you determine that, what you'll be able to start looking at is, with those shorter rest times, what's the recovery rate look like? So for example, if you do a medicine ball overhead run and gun throw for the radar gun, you see that the athlete threw 35 miles per hour. Give them 10 or 15 seconds rest, run up and do it again, and see what that drop-off rate is in performance. If it takes them 15 or 20 throws before they drop off 1 or 2 miles per hour in that medicine ball throw, then they're in pretty good condition for their sport, I would imagine. If they start dropping off in performance right away and they get very fatigued rather quickly, then they're probably not in very good shape to play their sport in terms of conditioning is concerned. So what I like to do for baseball players to test to make sure that their conditioning is good is I'll have them run a 20-yard sprint, rest 20 seconds, and then do it again. Have them do that 8 times, and then measure to see what that drop-off rate is like in their performance. Typically speaking, if the athlete is dropping off by more than 10% by that last sprint, then they might need to do a little bit more conditioning. But if they're able to stay within 10% of their peak sprint over the course of those 8 sprints, then they're in probably pretty good condition to play baseball. Lastly, if your goal is variance, then you're going to want to do some sort of exercise that's similar to what you were doing before, but switch it up just enough to get a slightly different adaptation. So for example, the bench press. It's a great movement, but if all you ever did was bench press, it's very difficult to get stronger over the long term because the bench press trains certain muscle groups to do a job just well enough to get the rep. Well, if your triceps are lacking, you might be able to get the bar off your chest, but then you're going to get stuck at about here where the triceps start to take over a lot more. So what you would want to do is do a variation of the bench press that stresses tricep strength a lot more for that lockout. And then after 4 to 6 weeks of training in that realm, you go back to the regular bench press and you should be able to blast through that rep a lot easier. That's the goal of variance. The goal of variance is to address certain weak spots that might not be addressed solely by that initial basic exercise that you were training with before. That's all we're looking to do here. We're trying to change things up just enough to stress the body in a way that would allow it to adapt and get stronger for that overall movement that we were training with before. So exercises that are unilateral based, single arm benching, single leg deadlift, single leg squat, RFE split squat, exercises like that are all good variance type exercises that will allow for changes to be made in a program so that an athlete can make continual progress. You can also use band resistance or chains as well to an exercise to get better at the lockout portion of a movement.